Good morning. Certainly good to see you out this morning. Always glad and thankful to be with you. Hope you're excited as I am anyways to be here. My plans have changed a little bit for this morning, I will be honest with you. I told you last week that we were going to begin a study this week looking at the nature of God. I'm excited for this study, but it's going to have to wait one more week because what came out of Sunday night was a significant amount of questions. We had a sermon that was streamed Sunday night, and I'm going to be honest with you, that's probably the most amount of feedback I've had on one with questions. Just comments in general, wanting to understand about some different aspects that went along with the sermon. So if you missed it, shame on you. But I'm kidding. I'm kidding, sort of. But a lot went into that. A lot came out of that, I should say. That has now led to follow up on that conversation a little bit more in depth than what I had planned for Sunday night. So the question was, why do bad things happen to good people? And of course, in talking about that, we talked about Job. Job always comes to mind when we get to that point. And so he was the focus of the conversation Sunday night, of course how brief as it was. But Job, being a good person, is the focus of that question for almost a singular purpose. When you think of Job, you think of suffering. That's what comes to mind, at least for me. An unbelievable amount that he went through that will hopefully make you at least reevaluate your troubles in life and say, you know what, my problems aren't so bad. Not compared to Job anyways. I mean, you think about it, you stubbed your toe this morning, all of a sudden it's a horrible day. It could have been a horrible day. Well, it wasn't close. But it could have been a horrible day if Ole Miss would have won yesterday. It'd been a pretty horrible day. All of these little things that take place that ruin our day. Now, have you lost every one of your children in the same day? Could you imagine that? Could you imagine your livelihood being destroyed, your possessions being taken, your money, everything taken from you? Now your health is deteriorated, you're near death. You won't die, of course, because that was the agreement. You couldn't. God told Satan, you can't take his life. Well, he took just about everything else. You look and you add to that what Job had. Job's support system was a wife that said, curse God and die. That was his support system. His three friends, Eliphaz, of course, being the prime leader there, says, well, you must have done something pretty bad. This is happening to you because that's how God operates. If you're bad, you're going to be punished in this life. So, Job, apparently you were pretty bad. Now, the sad truth for Job is this happened because he was righteous. Not because he was bad. Satan looked at him as an opportunity. So we ask the same questions, which is what led to this point today, that Job does, asking of God. God, why did this happen? Why would something like this, why would you allow this to happen? God, if you're good, why would this be the case? It doesn't seem fair. I don't understand. I'm a good person. There it is. That's where we go with it every time. I'm a good person. We're going to look more into that as we keep going. I want you to understand something, though. This isn't a question that only Job faced. Gideon asked the same question as the Israelites were being just berated by the Midianites for their horrible treatment. Habakkuk asked the same question about the Chaldeans that are coming to destroy Jerusalem and take the people captive. And the apostles wondered the exact same thing. If you got your Bibles, turn with me to John chapter 9. John chapter 9. That's where we're going to spend most of our time this morning. I want you to see the questions they're going to ask. John chapter 9, we're going to begin in verse 1. Now, as Jesus passed by, he saw a man who was blind from birth. And his disciples asked him, saying, Rabbi, who sinned, that this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Jesus answered, Neither this man nor his parents sinned, but that the works of God should be revealed in him. I must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. The night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. John 9, verses 1 through 5. So, the question of the hour is, why do bad things happen? I'm going to speculate and say you have asked that question before. Why did this happen? Or this variation of the question. God, why did you allow this to happen? That comes up a lot. Why would you allow this to happen? They see this blind man. He's blind from birth, we're told, which is significant. And they ask the question, well, who sinned? Whose fault is this that this man is blind? It's got to be somebody's fault. And the fact that he's blind from birth is significant because it's not something that could just be healed. Jesus is going to make the spittle. You remember, we didn't keep going. But he's going to heal the man by spitting in the clay, rubbing it in his eyes. Critics of the Bible would say, well, he made some sort of composite out of the material. It had something in it that somehow healed his eyes. Do you know what we've yet to be able to do in science? For somebody that was born blind, you know what we've yet to be able to do? Give sight. Now, your eye, people have been able to heal issues, but not from blindness. So it's very important we're told that. And the question is, whose fault is this? Is it the man's fault himself? Now, had he sinned before he was born? We hear that. We think that's kind of silly, right? He hadn't been born yet. How could he have sinned? Well, the Jewish rabbis taught this principle that Esau tried to kill Jacob in the womb. He had already sinned before he was ever born. That's why Jacob was the chosen and not Esau. The rabbis were teaching this. So, in their mind, you could sin in the womb before you were ever even born. So, was it the man's fault that he was born blind? If not the man, it has to be the sinful parents, because God is punishing them by hurting the son. That must be why something bad would happen to a good person. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and get something out of the way. I think this is important. If I were to take a poll, and I said, raise your hand if you consider yourself a good person, I would say likely every one of you would raise your hands. Right? Would you raise your hand? I figure most of you would. I probably would throw mine up as well. I give money to charities. I help people where I can. I feel like I'm a good person. Jesus made a statement in Matthew 19, verse 17. Likely you know where I'm going with this already. But do you remember the statement he made? There is none good but God. There is none good but God. Now, that just burst our bubble, didn't it? Because I was going to raise my hand and say, hey, I'm good. I'm a good person. The question is, why do bad things happen to good people? I'm a good person. Jesus said there is none good but God. Now, I was having this discussion with a guy the other day, and very similar discussion to this, and he didn't like that point that I was making. In fact, he got pretty offended by that statement. And I would say, hey, there is none good. None of us are good. We think we're good, but none of us are. And the response I got was, maybe as a judgmental Christian, you're not good, but there are good people. That was the gist of the response I got, with some language I wouldn't use. But that was the gist of it. Now, I didn't realize I was a judgmental Christian for stating biblical facts, but I guess that's how it came across, that I was being judgmental. So I asked him this fairly simple question that I'm going to ask you to help you answer for yourself, are you a good person? Simple question. How many of the 10 commandments have you broken? Simple question. Now, you'll say, I suspect you would say, we're not under the 10 commandments anymore. Fair point. You're under the 9 commandments. 9 of the 10 are in the New Testament. So, to be fair, how many of the 9 commandments have you broken? Sabbath doesn't matter anymore. That was done away with. The other 9, how many have you broken? I'm going to take a stab in the dark here. I'm going to say you've likely broken every one of them. Every one of them. I say that because I've broken every one of them. And I'm going to speculate and say you have as well. Now, you'll say, and it's funny you did that, you'll say, I haven't killed anybody. I've not killed anybody. What does Jesus say makes you guilty of murder? If you hate your brother, you're guilty of murder. So you may not have taken a knife and stabbed somebody. Have you hated somebody? Then guess what? You're guilty. You say, well, I haven't committed adultery. Now what does Jesus say equates to adultery? If you look upon somebody with lustful desires, you're guilty of adultery. So, how many of the 9 commandments have you broken? You don't have to tell me. That's for you to think about. I'll give you my answer. 9. Now, I'll give you this. All right, I'm going to kind of give this point. All right. I have no doubt whatsoever you are good people. I know you all now. I've known you for a while. I don't doubt that you're a good person, but you kind of have to add the ... by worldly standards. By what the world says is good, I'm in a room full of good people. Now, I don't want this to come across harsh. That's not saying a lot. I came across a poll that I thought was quite disturbing. The poll said, what would you be willing to do for $10 million? They asked 1,000 people. What would you be willing to do for $1 million? The list is pretty extravagant of how many said they would be prostitutes for a week. How many of them would just abandon their family altogether? High percentages. 7% of them is what was disturbing to me. 7% of them said they would be willing to kill somebody. 7%. So, in a room full of 1,000 people, 70 of them are willing to kill you for $10 million. Good by worldly standards doesn't really mean a whole lot. So I was quite surprised. That list was exhaustive. It was, not exhaustive I should say, it was several percent was willing to have a sex change operation. This is a long list. For $10 million, that's what they're willing to do. So with that in mind, think about this question. What do you imagine God would say about worldly goodness? Because we say we're good people. Why do bad things happen to good people? What does God say about our worldly goodness? Do you think He would say, hey, all right, that's good enough. You're a good enough worldly person. You can come on into heaven. Is that how that part works? Just good enough by worldly standards? If that's the case, the bar is not set very high. So, with that, I guess we can say we could drop the notion of good off of that. But let's go back to John chapter 9. I had a feeling I'd get off on a tangent on that. So let's go back to John chapter 9. Whose fault is it that this man is blind? Whose fault is it that something bad has happened? The disciples say it has to be a sinful act that caused this. Now, do all bad things in the world happen because of sin, of your personal sin? You stubbed your toe. Is that because of sin? Now, stubbing your toe is kind of a joke argument. Something bad happens. You're robbed, leaving the bank. Is that because of sin in your life? 2 parts, yes and no. Did your sin cause that to happen? No. Is that because of sin that it happened? Yes. You get what I mean by that? Why do you think this world is evil like it is and wicked as we call it? Because of sin. Go all the way back to the garden. How many generations do we have to go in worldly population before the first murder took place? The 2nd generation. That's it. Cain killed Abel. That's the progression of sin. By the time you get 6 chapters deep in the Bible, do you know what you find? A world flood because the people are only continually evil and God destroys them. 6 chapters in. Now granted that covers quite a few years, but still, you kind of see the point. So there's a popular opinion. I'm really saying all of this in 15 minutes to get to this point. There is a popular opinion out there along the lines of what Eliphaz told Job. And I covered this a little bit on Sunday night. Eliphaz was making the point to Job that if you have had a good life, if things have gone well for you in your life, it is because you're a good person and God is rewarding you for being a good person. Now, if you're a person that has struggled in their life, and you've had difficulties, you've lost someone close to you, you've struggled with things, you've dealt with bodily injury, all of these things, well, you're a bad person, and God is punishing you. That's this idea. That's what Eliphaz was telling Job. We still have that today. We still deal with that same kind of mindset today. In fact, Jewish rabbis would teach there is no death without sin, and there is no suffering without iniquity. Do you know why that's popular still today? Do you have any idea why that would still be so common? This sounds morbid almost to say. There's comfort in that for us. There's comfort in that. Now, I'm going to pick on Chip because I get to see Chip. I'm going to pick on Chip. Now, let's say I see Chip suffering. I don't want to see Chip suffering. But let's say I see Chip suffering. I can take comfort in that. You know why? Morbidly speaking. No, we shouldn't be like this. This is what people will do today. I can take comfort in that because I must be doing better than Chip. He's having all kind of problems. He's doing something bad. Something's wrong with him that he is suffering like this. I'm not. I'm doing pretty well. So therefore, I'm living a better life than Chip is. Do you see why we almost enjoy that? That's the same mindset that Eliphaz was telling Job. Job, you've done something. All of this has happened to you because you have done something. Now, what do the apostles just ask Jesus about the blind man? Who sinned that this man is suffering now? Whose fault is it that something bad has now happened? One of my favorite parables, and we didn't actually get to it, that was my plan. I told you this whole nature of God kind of just wouldn't get out of my head. So that's why we ended the parable series. But one of my favorite parables is the wise builder and the foolish builder. You remember we sing the song in Bible school. You remember how it goes? You know, wise man built his house on the rock. Remember all that? I should have got Will to sing that for us, just to aggravate him. Do you know a point that gets missed so much in that parable? Who did the rain fall on? It fell on both of them. Who did the floodwaters rise on? Both of them. But now, the wise man is the good man that built his house on the rock, so why would the rain fall on him if he's good? Now, the foolish man is foolish, and you would expect that to happen. Do you see our mindset to it? If you're good, bad things don't happen. That's how we live. That's when that gets lost. They both face the same devastating issues. I want you to notice a passage from Ecclesiastes chapter 9. Ecclesiastes 9 verse 11. I returned and saw under the sun that the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, nor bread to the wise, nor riches to the men of understanding, nor favor to men of skill. But time and chance happen to them all. Time and chance happen to them all. Something bad happens to you. Does that mean God did that to you? No. You lost a loved one. Does that mean God took that person from you? Now, you can easily make the argument, all right, God is omnipotent, omniscient, He is omnipresent, He is everywhere, He's over everything. And it's funny how we think that. I thought that for a while because at 23 years old, 4 months before our wedding, my mom died, very unexpectedly. And I honestly blamed God for that. I don't know why you would do that. That was my approach to it. And so we can look at God's will and say, God, His will is in everything. Now here's what I failed to understand at that point in time. God has an active will, where God makes something happen. God made the floodwaters rise in Genesis 6. But God also has a passive will, where He lets life happen. He lets life happen. Active will, passive will. Now, you read Ecclesiastes chapter 9, how does it end? But time and chance happen to all. Do you know why time and chance happens to all? Because God allows time and chance to happen to all. God allows life to play out. So we'll say every bad thing, God, why would you allow this to happen? When God allowed it to happen. God allowed your life to take place the way you wanted it to go. God allowed you to make your choices just like God allowed whoever else to make their choices in life. So I want you to notice Jesus' response to them, and it's along the same lines there. He says, none of them sinned. That's their question on who sinned that caused this. Who sinned? Someone had to have done something. He says, neither this man nor his parents sinned, but that the works of God should be revealed in him. And then he adds the statement, I must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Now, Jesus answers their question by really restating the question a little bit better. The question should not be, why has this happened? And you remember that was kind of the point from Sunday night. And that was the feedback I got with the questions really came to the point I was trying to make. Was if you believe in God, if your faith is centered in God, you don't have to know why. That's the question we want the answer to. Why would you allow this to happen? And the point from Sunday night was you don't have to know why. You have to trust in God, the one who does know why. You have to rely on Him, not that question, why. And so he says the question, it should not be why has this happened. The question should be what can God accomplish in this happening? Now, to be clear on this, Jesus never said that sickness and disease are never the consequences of sin. Don't mistake that either. To say, well, something bad, it can't be because of sin. You may want to jot down John 5, verse 14. I didn't put it on the slides. John chapter 5, verse 14. Says, afterwards Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, see, you have been made well. Sin no more, lest a worse thing come upon you. So don't think any possible bad thing can't be because of sin. It can't be because of sin in your life. Now, Jesus is not saying this. I want this to be important because you can easily take this lesson that he's teaching on the blind man and say, well, that's kind of hurtful of God to make this man blind all of his life for this very moment so that Jesus could manifest his power and heal the man. Seems kind of harsh. Don't take that to mean God made this man blind for this moment. That's not his point. Rather that God can take these unfortunate events and reveal himself in a unique way. That's where we struggle to really realize this. God lets life play out. Sometimes we don't want Him to. I'm going to tell you this. Every time I see that commercial for St. Jude's Hospital, and they're showing little kids dealing with cancer, I honestly get mad at the TV. Like, I wish you wouldn't show these commercials. Because it just breaks your heart to see that. And I'm sitting here asking the question, I don't know why God would let life play out like that. Just do away with it. Take it out of the way. I don't want to see any of that. But that's me trying to explain why. Wanting to know why that happens. And not relying on God instead. I've mentioned this before, and it's worth mentioning again because I believe it's important. Whereas I say I want God to take this out of the way, I also will stand here and say I'm thankful for free will. You understand you have free will, right? You know what free will means. You can choose what you do, how you do, when you do. You can choose what you worship, when you worship, how you worship. You want to worship money? Go worship money. You have free will. Do you know why you have free will? And this is we missed this too. Do you know what the whole purpose behind free will is? So that you can lovingly choose God. The whole reason you have free will. God didn't make you a robot that says you're going to worship me because you're going to worship me. He gave you the choice to choose to worship God. Love only comes from choice. Love is not forced. You choose to love. I had a picture I shared on Facebook yesterday. It popped up in Facebook memories of Melissa and I at her high school prom. I wasn't forced to love her. Here, say hindsight's 20/20. Anyway, I wasn't forced to love her. I chose that. It chose it for me. Someone did. Love comes from choice. Do you see that? God gave you free will so you could choose. Now, here's the problem with free will, and we ask the question, why bad things happen? You can't have free will and have God intervene every 5 minutes. That's not life playing out. That's the loss of free will. God's not going to take your free will. Now, does that mean God won't intercede at times in life? I'm not God. I can't speak for when He will and won't intercede. But God lets life play out. Now, you take a look at a world filled with free will. Do you like what you see? Turn the news on and watch it for 20 minutes. Do you like what you see? We have diseases, murder, hate, you name it. This is a sad one. You have because I know of an example of this, first-hand example of this. You have a mother who's a druggy mother, gets pregnant from a guy who's a drug addict. They have a child. This child is mentally messed up. Now, do you know the statement that I heard made? Why would God do this? Why would God let this child now be born with these issues? Now, who did it? Did God do it? Or did the druggy parents do it? But now, who got the blame for it? So, here's the almost ironic thing. Every time something bad happens, y'all know who's going to get blamed, right? God's going to get blamed every time. Towers came down. Why didn't God stop it? Coronavirus happens. Why didn't God stop it? Every time something happens, or else the other one I hear is God caused coronavirus. Now, could He? Sure. I don't know what His purpose would be, but I mean, sure, He could have. That's outside of my understanding that He did or didn't do that. But every time something happens, we say, well, why would God do it? Inevitably, it always comes back to being God's fault. Do you know what the sad part of that is? This is the I don't want to say humorous. It's not humorous. This is the irony. Something bad has happened. I'm mad at God. I'm going to turn to the world that caused the problem in the first place because I can't trust in God who would let something like that happen in a dying world filled with sin, which is our nature, sinful nature, that caused the situation in the world that's there. So we've gone full circle back to ourselves to basically say, I can't rely on God because I'm sinful, and this is what's the result of my sin. You see how we end up there? We blame God for our actions, and then say, I can't worship God because God let me live the way I wanted to live. So therefore, I can't worship God. So we turn and we choose a dying world instead. Why would something bad happen to good people? I think y'all are playing tricks on me with that clock. Clock moving fast. All right. James 4, verses 13 and 14. Part of the problem where we struggle with bad things happening is our taking for granted good things. So listen to what James wrote. We know the end of it. We always read the end of verse 14, but I want you to listen to the build-up to verse 14. Because you hear that all the time. James 4:14, life is but a vapor, here 1 minute, gone the next. What leads to that? Come now, you who say today or tomorrow we'll go to such city, spend a year there, buy, sell, make profit. But listen to what verse 14 says. Whereas you don't know what will happen tomorrow. You say, well, why would something bad happen to me today? You don't know what's going to come of it tomorrow. This illustration I found, I've got this site that kind of gives you illustrations when it comes to putting sermons together, like illustration for this passage to help get the picture. And this one preacher that I was listening to was describing what happened to him. And he described these 3 boys that had gone into a well house that some guy was working on. He had the leads for the motor unwired. And one of the youngest boys touched one of the wires and electrocuted it, killed him on the spot. Stopped his heart. It killed him. Now, he was young, before the age of accountability. Dead on the scene. His parents were not Christians, didn't disbelieve, but didn't really believe in Christ either. But they took comfort in one thing. They knew the boy was under that age of accountability. He didn't know what sin was, and they had heard that in that spot he would go to heaven. They took comfort in that. They began to study in that. 2 months later, they repent, they become Christians. What I found so amazing in that is you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. The preacher that was giving that illustration was one of the 3 boys, and it was his younger brother that was killed that day. His parents had become Christians, ended up raising him in a God-fearing house. He became a preacher and was given the illustration of what took place in a situation where we would stop and say, why would God let something like that ever happen? And we don't ever see what's happening tomorrow. Now, I don't want either one of my kids to be electrocuted. But if that were to happen, I'm not going to stop and say, why would God let something like that happen? God lets life happen. We don't always like it. Sometimes we wish God would intervene. You could easily say, did God cause that little boy to die? No. When you read that parable, it's not a parable, when you read what took place in John chapter 9, I'm going to start wrapping up. When you read what took place in John chapter 9, do you think that blind man woke up that day and said, I'm going to see today? My eyes are going to be opened. I'm going to have spittle and clay put on my eyes. I'm going to go dip in the pool of Siloam and I'm going to see. Do you think that's what he thought? You look at some of the other examples we talked about in the very beginning of the sermon. Do you think that Job thought he was going to lose every one of his children that day? Do you think that Job, down the road, 40 some odd chapters later, thought he would be blessed more than he ever was before for not abandoning God, even though he had lost all of his children, all of his possessions? Do you think that's what he thought? Do you think Gideon thought he was going to defeat the Midianites with 300 of the not so sharpest tools in the shed, drinking water like dogs? Probably seemed quite doubtful. You could go down the list. Pick examples. Lazarus. I love reading Lazarus. Do you think when Lazarus took his last breath, and he said, Jesus will be here in a few days, he'll raise me from the dead? You think that's what happened? I think Joshua walking around the walls of Jericho for 6 days going, this is clearly going to work. We're just going to walk around one more time. We're going to walk around one more day. This time we're going to do 7 days. And it's going to fall. It's going to work. You think that's what they thought? What a difference a day makes. Now here's the reality. I'm going to just start wrapping up. Here's the reality for you. Why do bad things happen to good people? You live in a fallen world. You live in a sin-filled world. Here's the hard part to hear. Of your own doing. Of my own doing. We don't like what society is like. Guess who is society? We are. We're society. And we want to know why we live in such an evil world. Do you know what the history of man shows? We're pretty evil. We're pretty evil. And so I found myself asking the same question you do. Why would God let something like this happen? Because God lets you make your choices. What's the saying? If you make your bed, you got to lie in it too. Yeah, I butchered that. I can't remember how it goes. Now, one more passage I want you to think about. Romans 5, verses 3 through 5. We're not even going to get to go back to our scripture reading, Will. I dropped the ball, man. We're not going to make it all the way back. Romans 5, verse 3 through 5 says, more than that, we rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character. Character produces hope, and hope does not put us to shame. Because God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who has been given to us. Hope does not put us to shame. So, in a world that just is filled with evil, lots of bad things happen, the world gets down and out, why don't you do the same thing? every time something bad happens. The rain came down on the wise man. Rain came down on the foolish man. Why did the wise man say, forget this building. I'm done. I'm not going to do any more building because the rain keeps coming down. Noah could have said, I'm not going to build this ark. I don't know what rain is. Down the list you go. I'm not going to walk around the walls of Jericho 7 times. When we don't understand, we doubt. When we doubt, we stop. Hope does not put us to shame. So, is your hope in this world that's filled with hurt, evil, pain, wickedness? Or is your hope above this world? When something bad happens, inevitably we blame God. I get that. Never fails. We blame God. That's the results of being in a dying world. Are you a part of that world, or are you part of the body of hope? Freedom in Christ. Talking to a room full of Christians, I understand the answer. And I pray you take hope in that every time something bad happens in your life, because it's going to happen. And as Melton is going to lead us in this invitation song here in just a moment, I want to encourage you with this. Find your hope in the proper place. In God, not in a world that's causing the problems in the first place. If you're in need this morning, I want to encourage you to respond to this invitation. You would not be alone if you're a Christian that says, I have struggled because so many bad things have happened. I've wavered in my faith because bad things have happened. You would probably be in the majority of Christians, not the minority. If you're in need this morning, I want to encourage you to come forward. We'll be happy to pray with you, pray for you as Melton leads us in this invitation song.